The mailman froze on the sidewalk, staring at the tiny white puppy standing on its hind legs, trembling, begging, literally begging, for help. Its little paws reached toward him as if trying to speak. The puppy's eyes were wide, frantic, desperate. Something was terribly wrong. It barked once, then tugged at his pant leg, pulling him toward the house behind it. The porch was covered in unopened newspapers. The door was slightly open, and there was an eerie silence inside. The mailman swallowed hard. He didn't know it yet, but what he was about to find would change everything. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Back to the story. Maple Street was always peaceful in the early morning, the kind of quiet suburban stretch where nothing unusual ever happened. Mailman Henry Walker had been delivering letters there for almost 15 years, and he could walk the route with his eyes half closed. Soft sunlight filtered through the maple leaves, casting warm patterns on the tidy sidewalks. Sprinklers ticked rhythmically on freshly cut lawns. Dogs barked lazily behind fences. Bored cats lounged on porches, and Henry hummed as he sorted the envelopes in his bag. It was just another ordinary day, until it suddenly wasn't. As he turned onto the walkway of house number 14, something white moved in the corner of his eye. At first, Henry thought it was a plastic bag caught in the wind, but when he looked again, his steps halted. Standing in the middle of the path, almost perfectly still, was a small fluffy puppy, snow-white, wide-eyed, and trembling. Henry blinked. Puppies usually ran away or barked excitedly when they saw him, but this one didn't run. It didn't bark. Instead, it stared directly at him, frozen like a tiny statue carved from fear itself. Its little chest rose and fell quickly, and its ears drooped low against its head. "Hey there, buddy," Henry said softly, lowering his voice. "You scared me for a second." The puppy didn't move. It just watched him, eyes shining with something Henry couldn't quite name. Panic? Desperation? He took another step forward, and that was when the puppy did something Henry had never seen in his entire career. It lifted its tiny front paws off the ground and stood upright on its hind legs, wobbling but determined, like it was trying to appear taller or communicate in some strange way. Henry froze. Dogs didn't normally behave like this, not unless they were trained or terrified. The puppy let out a tiny whine, then another. Its tail didn't wag. Its paws lifted a little higher, trembling violently now. It wasn't begging for food. It was begging for something else entirely. "Whoa, what's wrong, little guy?" Henry whispered, suddenly alert. The puppy took 2 unsteady steps backward, still upright, then dropped to all fours and ran toward the porch, only to stop halfway, turn around, and make a soft, pleading bark. Then it ran back to Henry and tugged at his pant leg. Henry's heartbeat quickened. This wasn't random. This puppy wanted him to follow. And Maple Street, for the first time in 15 years, didn't feel peaceful anymore. Henry had delivered mail to hundreds of homes, and he had met every type of dog imaginable. Barkers, chasers, tail waggers, and even one Chihuahua who hated the postal service with legendary passion. But never, not once, had he encountered a puppy behaving like this one. The little white fluffball wasn't afraid of him, wasn't territorial, and wasn't playful. It was something else entirely. Something urgent. The puppy pulled at his pant leg again, harder this time, letting out a series of soft, quivering yips. Henry crouched down, trying to calm it. "Easy now," he murmured, extending a gentle hand. "I'm not here to hurt you." His surprise, the puppy didn't shy away. Instead, it rushed closer and pressed its tiny head into his palm, shaking like it had been through something far beyond what a creature its size should ever endure. Henry felt its rapid heartbeat against his fingers, thudding wildly, almost frantic. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're all right." But the puppy wasn't soothed. It backed away and lifted its paw, tapping Henry's knee like a child tugging someone's sleeve. Then it spun around and raced toward the porch again, stopping at the bottom step and turning its head sharply as if making sure Henry was watching. That's when Henry finally sensed it. Something deeper than fear. The puppy wasn't just trying to get attention. It was pleading, not barking at a squirrel pleading, not hungry for a treat pleading. This was different. This was a cry for help. Henry slowly straightened, his instincts stirring like an alarm being triggered inside him. The house behind the puppy suddenly looked different, less like a cozy home and more like a scene hiding a secret. The porch was cluttered with old newspapers. The mailbox overflowed with envelopes. The curtains were drawn, and the windows looked unnaturally dark for mid-morning. It was as if the house had stopped breathing. "Is someone inside?" Henry asked softly, half expecting the puppy to respond. Shockingly, it did. The puppy barked once, sharp, urgent, and ran back to him again, circling his legs before darting toward the door with a desperate whine. Henry exhaled slowly, tension crawling up his spine. He couldn't ignore this. Not a trembling puppy, not a house that looked abandoned overnight, not the kind of silence that felt wrong. He tightened the strap of his mailbag, eyes locked on the tiny creature pacing anxiously. Something was happening here. Something the puppy was trying to show him, and Henry knew he had no choice but to follow. Henry stepped closer to the porch, guided by the puppy's frantic pacing. The moment his foot touched the first step, a strange stillness settled over the house, like the air itself was holding its breath. Maple Street usually hummed with life, lawnmowers buzzing, kids riding bikes, neighbors chatting over fences. But around this house it felt eerily quiet, almost disconnected from the world around it. The puppy sniffed the ground near the doormat, then looked back at Henry, tail tucked tightly between its legs. That tiny gesture made Henry's stomach tighten. Puppies didn't fake fear. They didn't pretend. Whatever frightened this little one had to be real. Henry's gaze swept over the porch. Newspapers were stacked haphazardly near the steps. Some were damp, edges curling from days of morning dew. He noticed the dates on the topmost one, 3 days old. That wasn't normal. The homeowner, Mrs. Foster, was kind, punctual, and always greeted him with a smile, even offering cookies some days. She never left her papers out, not even for a single morning. His eyes shifted to the mailbox. It bulged with envelopes wedged so tightly he wondered how the last one had fit. 3 days of mail. Untouched. Henry's heartbeat thudded louder. Something wasn't right. The puppy scratched lightly at the base of the door, letting out a trembling whimper. Henry knelt beside it, brushing a hand over its soft head. "Hey, what happened in there, little one?" he murmured. The puppy pressed against his knee, as if begging him not to leave. Henry reached out and touched the doorknob. It felt colder than it should have, even in the warm morning air. He pushed gently. To his surprise, the door creaked open without resistance, drifting inward like it had been left that way for hours, maybe longer. A faint, stale smell wafted out. Not rotten, not dangerous, just wrong. Like a house that had missed its morning routine and forgotten to wake up. "Mrs. Foster?" Henry called out softly, stepping 1 foot inside. No response, no movement, no familiar shuffle of her slippers. The puppy squeezed past his leg and darted into the dim foyer, stopping halfway to glance back with a sharp, urgent bark, as if commanding him now, not asking. Henry swallowed. This wasn't a random lost puppy. This was a messenger. Something had happened in this house, and the little dog was determined not to face it alone. Henry hesitated on the threshold, the mix of cool air and silence inside wrapping around him like an invisible warning. He wasn't supposed to enter people's homes. Mail carriers had strict rules, but rules didn't account for trembling puppies desperately begging for help. And this puppy, standing at the edge of the hallway with pleading eyes, wasn't giving him any choice. "All right, I'm coming," Henry murmured, stepping fully inside. The puppy immediately turned and scampered deeper into the house, its tiny nails skittering across the hardwood floor. Every few steps it paused, looked back at Henry, and barked, a short, trembling sound full of urgency. Henry followed slowly, scanning the hallway. Family photos lined the walls, Mrs. Foster smiling with her grandkids, a picture of her late husband, a framed collage of birthday moments. Everything looked normal, yet wrong. Dust flecks floated lazily in a beam of sunlight from a half-open curtain. A mug lay on the floor, shattered in 2 pieces. A lamp had been knocked over, its shade tilted awkwardly. His pulse quickened. Something had happened here. The puppy stopped at the entrance to the living room, whining as it pawed at the carpet. Then, with a sudden burst of determination, it grabbed the cuff of Henry's pant leg with its teeth and pulled. Henry nearly stumbled. "Hey, easy, easy." But the puppy wouldn't let go. Its growls weren't threatening, they were desperate. It tugged again, harder, dragging him another step forward. Okay, I'm coming. Show me." The puppy released him and bolted, toward a closed door at the far end of the hallway. It scratched frantically, its whines rising in pitch until they echoed like tiny cries. Henry's breath hitched. Mrs. Foster's bedroom. He took a shaky step toward the door. The puppy circled anxiously, hopping from paw to paw as if screaming without words. "Mrs. Foster," Henry called, voice cracking slightly. "It's Henry, from the Postal Service. Are you okay in there?" Silence. Then, barely audible, a sound came from inside. A soft thump, a faint dragging, a muffled, pained moan. Henry froze, heart slamming against his ribs. He wasn't imagining it. He wasn't overreacting. Someone was in that room. Someone who couldn't get up. And the puppy knew it. Henry reached for the doorknob, his hand shaking now. Not from fear, but from the realization that he might be the only person who could help in time. He looked down. The puppy stared up at him, eyes wide and pleading. "All right, little hero," Henry whispered. Then he turned the knob. The moment Henry pushed the door open, a cold breath of stale air drifted past him, carrying the faint scent of something burned, like a pot left too long on the stove. The room was dim, the curtains half drawn, allowing only thin slivers of sunlight to cut through the shadows. As his eyes adjusted, the details slowly emerged, each one tightening the knot in his chest. A small bedside table lay on its side, its drawer spilled open across the floor. A cup of tea had shattered into a dozen pieces, dried stains marking where the liquid had spilled. A pair of slippers sat unevenly near the bed, as though someone had tried to reach them and failed. And near the corner of the room, a bottle of medication lay uncapped, pills scattered across the hardwood like tiny white beads. Henry's breath came shallow. No one left a room like this on purpose. The puppy rushed ahead, nose pressed to the floor as it sniffed frantically. It let out a sharp whine, then hurried. Toward the far side of the bed, its tail tucked so far under its belly it nearly disappeared. Henry's heart pounded as he followed, each step feeling heavier than the last. "Mrs. Foster?" he called softly again, though now his voice trembled more from dread than uncertainty. No answer, just silence. And then, barely audible, a faint broken gasp rose from behind the bed. Henry's stomach dropped. He hurried around the foot of the bed and the puppy beat him there. It scrambled desperately, scratching at the floor and nudging at something hidden in the shadows. Henry crouched down and his breath caught painfully in his throat. There she was. Mrs. Foster lay curled awkwardly on the floor, one arm twisted beneath her, the other reaching weakly toward the overturned table. Her face was pale, too pale, and a thin sheen of sweat glistened on her forehead. Her eyes fluttered open for a second, unfocused, then closed again as if the effort had drained all her strength. "Mrs. Foster!" Henry whispered urgently, dropping to his knees beside her. The puppy whimpered and pressed its little body against her arm, licking her trembling fingers. Henry gently lifted her shoulders. "Can you hear me?" he asked, trying to steady his voice. A faint sound escaped her lips, something between a whisper and a sigh. It wasn't a word. It was a plea. Henry glanced around the room. The medicine bottle, the shattered cup, the stale smell, the silence. Everything pointed to one terrifying truth. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. And time was running out. Henry's hands trembled as he supported Mrs. Foster's shoulders, trying to ease her onto her back without hurting her. The puppy pressed itself against her side, whining softly, its small body quivering with fear and devotion. Henry could feel the rapid rise and fall of her breath, shallow, irregular, dangerously weak. She tried to open her eyes again, but they fluttered like a candle fighting the wind. "Hang on, Mrs. Foster," Henry whispered urgently. "I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." The puppy barked once, sharp and pleading, then nudged her chin with its nose as if begging her to respond. It wasn't just loyal. It was terrified. Henry could see the panic in its little movements, the desperation in its eyes. Henry pulled his phone from his pocket with shaking fingers. Before he could dial, a faint sound escaped Mrs. Foster's lips, a soft moan, a struggle for breath. Her fingers twitched weakly, brushing against his sleeve as if she needed to tell him something. "Don't try to speak," Henry urged, gently squeezing her hand. "I'm calling an ambulance right now." But before he could press the button, the puppy suddenly barked again, louder this time, and ran toward the doorway. It turned back, yipping insistently, then darted back to Henry and pushed its paws against his leg. "What is it?" Henry asked, confused. The puppy bolted to the corner of the room where the fallen cup lay, shattered. It scratched at the floor, then ran back and scratched at Mrs. Foster's arm, as though trying to show Henry something he wasn't seeing. Henry's gaze followed its frantic movements, and then he noticed it. A dark stain near the corner of the overturned bedside table. A faint trail leading from the kitchen doorway. The smell he'd sensed earlier now made perfect sense. Something had burned. Something had spilled. Something had caused her collapse. "Did you fall trying to reach this?" Henry murmured, piecing the story together. Mrs. Foster let out another faint moan, and the puppy rushed back to her side, pressing its face against her hand, desperate to comfort her. Henry didn't hesitate. He dialed emergency services with one hand while keeping the other firmly on her shoulder. "This is an emergency," he said, voice steadier than he felt. "An elderly woman is unconscious. She's breathing, but barely. We need help, immediately." As he ended the call, Mrs. Foster's breathing hitched, her chest rising unevenly. Henry leaned closer. "Hold on. Please, hold on." The puppy curled against her, trembling, but determined to stay by her side until help arrived, and Henry realized with a shiver that, if not for this tiny little dog, she might never have been found at all. Henry stayed crouched beside Mrs. Foster, his hand gently supporting her trembling shoulder, while the tiny puppy pressed itself protectively against her chest. The room felt colder now, as if the walls themselves absorbed the fear and uncertainty hanging in the air. Every second stretched unbearably long. He kept glancing toward the door, waiting for distant sirens, praying they would come faster. Mrs. Foster stirred faintly, her eyelids fluttering open for less than a heartbeat. When they closed again, Henry caught a glimpse of something haunting. Pain, confusion, and an unmistakable fear. It cut through him sharply. She had been lying here for hours, maybe longer, alone, helpless, hoping someone, anyone, would come. "Help is on the way," Henry whispered, fighting to keep his voice steady. He squeezed her frail hand gently. "Just stay with me." The puppy barked a soft, high-pitched sound, then scrambled toward the bedside table again. It pawed frantically at the fallen drawer, then at a crumpled cloth lying nearby. Henry leaned closer, trying to understand what it wanted him to see. That's when he noticed the cloth was actually a dish towel, scorched at one end, blackened as though it had caught fire briefly before being smothered. His eyes widened. He looked at the faint burn marks on the wooden floor, then at the spilled cup, then at the medication bottle lying on its side. Pieces of a terrible puzzle fell into place. She must have been in the kitchen, maybe boiling water, maybe making tea, when something went wrong. Hot liquid spilled. Maybe she slipped. Maybe she fainted. Maybe a mix of medication and heat overwhelmed her. However it happened, she collapsed. Unable to call for help, and the puppy, this tiny, helpless creature, had watched it all. Henry swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. "You've been trying to save her this whole time, haven't you?" he whispered, looking at the trembling pup. The puppy whimpered and pressed its tiny body closer to Mrs. Foster's hand, licking her fingers with frantic devotion. Suddenly, a faint, broken whisper escaped the woman's lips. Henry leaned closer. Baby," she breathed, so soft he barely heard it. The puppy froze. Henry realized instantly. She didn't mean a human baby. She meant her baby, the little puppy who'd refused to give up on her. Henry felt a swell of emotion rise in his chest. This wasn't just loyalty. It was love, fear, desperation. A small life trying to protect the one person it had, and the shock of it hit him with full force. This puppy wasn't just seeking help. It had been fighting, alone, to keep Mrs. Foster alive. The faint whisper from Mrs. Foster barely faded before Henry snapped into action. He pressed his phone tighter against his ear, listening for the distant sounds of sirens. Nothing yet, not even an echo. Every second felt like it stretched into an eternity, each breath she took sounding thinner, weaker, more fragile than the one before. Henry's pulse hammered in his ears. He couldn't let her slip away. Not now. Not after the puppy had fought so desperately to get help. He gently adjusted her position, lifting her head slightly to help her breathe. "Stay with me, Mrs. Foster," he murmured, his voice breaking. "Help is coming, I promise." The puppy barked sharply as if urging him to hurry, then rushed to the door, skidding on the wooden floor before racing back to her side. It whined loudly, shoving its tiny head under her hand as though trying to lend her strength. Henry felt a sting behind his eyes. This little creature had more courage than most adults he'd met. He dialed emergency services again. "Please," he said urgently, "I need an update. She's barely conscious. Her breathing is fading." "Units are en route," the operator replied. "Hold her steady. Keep talking to her." Henry swallowed hard. "Okay, I will." He leaned closer. "Can you hear me?" he asked softly. "Your puppy's right here. He's been protecting you this whole time." Her eyelids flickered just for a moment. That tiny movement hit Henry like a spark of hope. She was fighting. She wasn't giving up. The puppy yipped and pressed its paw against her arm as if reminding her she wasn't alone. Henry gently brushed a piece of hair from her forehead. "You're strong," he whispered. "Just hold on a little longer." Finally, faint but unmistakable, the sound he'd been praying for pierced the silence. Sirens, distant, but coming closer. Henry's heart surged with relief. He stood and hurried to the front door, the puppy trailing anxiously behind him. Through the window, he saw flashing lights reflecting off the houses across the street. "They're here," he said breathlessly, sprinting back to the bedroom. The puppy barked in excitement this time, hopeful, urgent, full of life. Moments later, paramedics rushed inside with equipment in hand. Henry stepped aside, but the puppy refused to move from Mrs. Foster's side until a medic gently lifted it away. "She's critical," one paramedic said, checking her pulse, "but she's still with us." Henry exhaled shakily. The race wasn't over yet, but thanks to the little puppy, it had begun just in time. The paramedics moved quickly, but even their urgency couldn't hide the worry on their faces. One knelt beside Mrs. Foster, checking her pulse, while another placed an oxygen mask gently over her mouth. Henry stood back, his fingers tight around the strap of his mailbag, helplessly watching as the life seemed to drain from her more with each passing second. The puppy pawed at the paramedic's arm until he carefully set it aside, whispering, "Easy, little one. We're helping her." But the puppy didn't understand. It whined louder, pacing in frantic circles, its tiny claws clicking anxiously on the hardwood floor. Every time Mrs. Foster's breathing hitched, the puppy yelped sharply, as though feeling her pain itself. Henry knelt down and wrapped his arms around the trembling pup, whispering, "They're doing their best. She needs them now." The puppy trembled in his hold, but didn't take its eyes off her. "She's losing consciousness," one paramedic said, voice low and tense. "Blood pressure is dropping fast." Henry felt his stomach twist. "Is she going to make it?" he asked quietly, afraid to hear the answer. "It's hard to say," the paramedic replied. "She's been down for a while. We need to move her right now." They lifted her carefully onto the stretcher. Her hand slipped limply to the side, and the puppy rushed forward, pressing its face against her fingers. A soft, broken whimper escaped her as if she recognized the touch, even in her weakened state. "We have to go," the paramedic said. As they wheeled her toward the front door, the puppy followed so closely he nearly tripped over their boots. Every few steps it let out a desperate bark, pleading with them not to take her away. Henry scooped the puppy up, holding it against his chest as he hurried behind the stretcher. Outside, the flashing lights cast red and blue reflections across the neighborhood. A few neighbors peeked from their windows, confused by the sudden commotion. The paramedics opened the ambulance doors and guided the stretcher inside. The puppy squirmed in Henry's arms, trying with all its strength to leap after her. "She'll hear you," Henry murmured, tightening his hold. "She knows you're here." Inside the ambulance, a medic called out, "Go! Go! We're losing time!" The doors slammed shut. The siren roared to life, and as the ambulance sped away, Henry stood frozen on the sidewalk, the puppy trembling violently against him, its eyes fixed on the disappearing vehicle, its tiny heart breaking in his arms. The woman's condition wasn't just serious, it was becoming a fight for her life. The flashing lights faded down Maple Street until they were nothing more than distant glimmers. Henry stood frozen at the curb, the tiny puppy trembling in his arms like a lost heartbeat. Its small chest rose and fell in frantic, uneven breaths, each one filled with fear. Henry swallowed hard. He had never felt this helpless, not as a mailman, not as a neighbor, not as a human being. "Come on," he whispered softly, rubbing the puppy's head. "Let's get you somewhere safe." The puppy didn't resist as he carried it back onto the porch and sat on the steps. It pressed its head into his chest, letting out shaky, little whines that told a story without words. Henry felt the weight of them, heavy and heartbreaking. Mrs. Foster had always been a quiet woman, living alone after her husband passed years ago. But she loved animals. Everyone knew that. She fed stray cats, left bowls of water out for birds, and once rescued a limping squirrel after it fell from a tree. But the puppy, no one had seen it before today. Henry gently lifted its chin, studying the little creature more closely. Its fur, though soft, was uneven. Patches had been shaved or matted. A faint scar ran across its front leg, and despite its small size, its eyes held a depth of fear far beyond its age. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Henry murmured. The puppy's ears drooped, and it curled tighter against him. Then, as if trying to explain everything, it let out one soft bark and looked toward the empty house. Henry suddenly remembered a brief conversation he'd had with Mrs. Foster 2 weeks ago. She'd mentioned a little angel she found behind the grocery store dumpster, shivering, starving, abandoned. She had nursed it back to health, bottle-fed it, kept it warm under a blanket every night. "This must be you," Henry whispered, emotion choking him. "You're that angel." The puppy blinked, eyes glassy, and nudged its nose against Henry's hand as if confirming his words. It made sense now. The puppy wasn't just loyal. It owed its life to her. She saved it first. And today, it had tried to return the favor, scratching, barking, begging strangers on the street, doing everything in its fragile power to get help before it was too late. Henry held the puppy closer, feeling its tiny heartbeat against his chest. "She saved you," he whispered, voice trembling. "And you saved her." The weight of the puppy's loyalty struck him deeply. This wasn't just a pet. It was her companion, her family, her hero. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of machines. Soft afternoon light filtered through the blinds, painting thin golden stripes across the bed where Mrs. Foster lay. Pale, fragile, but alive. Henry stood near the doorway, the puppy cradled in his arms like a trembling bundle of hope. It had refused to calm down during the ride, whining non-stop, shaking as though every breath depended on the woman behind the curtain. A nurse stepped out of the room, gently closing her chart. "She's stable," she said softly. "Still weak, but she woke up for a moment." Henry felt his heart lift. "Did she say anything?" The nurse hesitated, then smiled kindly. She whispered one word, just one. The puppy stiffened in Henry's arms, its ears perking. "What word?" Henry asked. "Baby." Henry felt the puppy lurch forward, its tiny body trembling violently as it tried to climb down from his chest. The nurse's eyes softened. "I think she meant him." Henry swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "Can he see her?" "Just for a moment," she nodded. "But be gentle. Her heart is still fragile." Henry lowered the puppy onto the floor. The moment its paws touched the tile, it sprinted, its nails clicking frantically as it rushed through the doorway. Henry followed, breath catching at the sight before him. Mrs. Foster lay propped up slightly, eyes fluttering weakly. She looked impossibly small against the white sheets, her breathing thin but steady. The puppy scrambled onto the edge of the bed with surprising determination, whimpering softly as it crawled toward her hand. Her fingers twitched, then curled, weakly but purposefully, around the puppy's fur. The little dog pressed its face into her palm, letting out a trembling cry that echoed like relief, fear, and love all at once. Mrs. Foster's cracked lips curved into the faintest smile. "There you are," she whispered, voice barely louder than a breath. "My little baby." Henry stepped closer, unable to stop, the emotion tightening his chest. She stroked the puppy's head with a trembling finger, her gaze drifting toward Henry. "You found us," she whispered. He shook his head gently. "No, he found me." A tear slipped from the corner of her eye. "He saved me." Henry nodded. "He never gave up." Mrs. Foster took a slow, shaky breath, her hand still clinging to the puppy. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're my hero." The puppy whimpered softly and curled into her side, refusing to move. Finally, where it belonged. News of the rescue spread through Maple Street faster than Henry expected. By evening, neighbors who usually hurried past each other without a glance stood in small clusters, whispering in awe about the puppy who wouldn't stop crying until help arrived. Some had seen the ambulance. Others had spotted Henry carrying the trembling little dog, its fur soaked in tears. And every single person felt the same thing: shock, admiration, and a sudden warmth for the tiny hero who refused to give up. At the hospital, the energy shifted the moment the staff learned what had happened. Nurses peeked into Mrs. Foster's room more often than necessary, each one lingering just a little longer to watch the fragile woman rest peacefully with the puppy curled against her side. Doctors paused in the hallway, shaking their heads in disbelief. "That little thing did all that?" one whispered. Henry nodded, pride swelling in his chest. He didn't stop. Not for a second. the doctor exhaled softly. Animals sense things we can't. If he hadn't acted when he did— He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. The truth hung heavy between them. The puppy had saved her life. Later that afternoon, the head nurse approached Henry as he waited outside the room. She held a clipboard, but her expression was gentle. "You know," she said, "most people wouldn't have listened. They'd have brushed it off, gone on with their day." Henry shook his head. "I almost did, but something about the way he begged. It didn't feel like a normal dog reaction." "Well," she smiled, "you made the right choice. That little hero had more determination than most adults I know." Down the hallway, visitors and staff couldn't stop stealing glances at the sight inside the room. A tiny white puppy, curled protectively beside an elderly woman who slept with a small smile on her face. It was the kind of image that made strangers choke up without understanding why. Word traveled further. A security guard snapped a discreet photo for the hospital bulletin board. "Local puppy saves elderly woman's life." A custodian stopped Henry just to ask, "Is it true he stood on his hind legs and begged you?" Henry nodded, as if he was talking. "Kindest little soul I've ever seen," the custodian murmured. By evening, the story had become a quiet symbol of hope inside the hospital walls. People passed the room with softened faces, whispering that they wished the world had more loyalty like that, more love like the bond between Mrs. Foster and her tiny rescue pup. And Henry knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning of the puppy's impact. The next morning, the hospital felt different, brighter somehow, softer, as if the air itself carried a quiet sense of hope. Henry walked down the hallway with the puppy in his arms, its little body vibrating with excitement. It had barely slept all night, pacing, whining, staring at the door every time footsteps echoed outside. Now, sensing where they were going, the puppy squirmed eagerly, tail wagging in rapid little bursts. "Easy," Henry chuckled, tightening his hold. "You'll see her in just a second." A nurse waiting by the doorway smiled warmly. "She's awake now," she whispered, "and she's been asking for her little hero." At the words, "little hero," the puppy let out a tiny bark that made everyone in earshot smile. The nurse gently pushed the door open and Henry stepped inside. Mrs. Foster sat propped up against her pillows, IV lines trailing from her arm, oxygen gently flowing through a small tube by her nose. Her face was still pale, but her eyes, those soft, kind eyes, were alive again, bright with a spark that hadn't been there the day before. The moment she saw the puppy, her lips trembled. "Oh, my baby," she whispered. Henry placed the puppy gently on the bed. The little dog wasted no time. It scrambled up her blanket, pressing itself against her chest with frantic urgency, as though trying to make up for every second it had been forced apart from her. Mrs. Foster wrapped her fragile arms around it, tears slipping down her cheeks as she stroked its fur with trembling hands. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm right here." The puppy whimpered, licking her chin, her cheek, even her fingertips. Henry could feel the emotion knotting in his throat. He had seen reunions before, soldiers with families, lost pets with their owners, but nothing compared to this delicate, powerful moment. It felt like watching two pieces of a broken world finally snap back into place. A few nurses lingered quietly in the doorway, wiping their eyes as they watched. One whispered, "I've never seen loyalty like that." Mrs. Foster looked up at Henry. "Thank you," she said softly. "But truly, he saved me. I could hear him crying, scratching, trying so hard to get someone's attention." Henry smiled gently. "He never stopped. Not once." She pressed her forehead gently against the puppy's. "You brave little soul," she whispered. "You weren't supposed to save me, but you did." The puppy curled tightly against her, breathing in rhythm with her heartbeat. For the first time in days, the room felt whole again. The sun dipped lower outside the hospital window, casting warm amber hues across the room as if blessing the fragile peace inside. Mrs. Foster sat quietly, the puppy curled against her side, its tiny breaths rising and falling in a soft rhythm. Henry remained seated in the chair near the foot of the bed, watching the quiet reunion unfold with a heaviness in his chest he hadn't expected. Something about this tiny dog's devotion had carved itself into him, deeper than he could explain. A gentle knock sounded on the door before the doctor stepped in. "Good evening," he said warmly. "How are we feeling?" Mrs. Foster managed a tired smile. "Grateful," she whispered. "More than I can say." The puppy lifted its head at the doctor's voice, but when it sensed no threat, it placed its paw protectively over her blanket. The doctor chuckled. "Quite the guardian, isn't he?" "He always has been," she said softly. "Even before today." Henry leaned forward. "You rescued him, didn't you?" Mrs. Foster nodded. "He was abandoned behind a store. Shaking. Starving. He had nothing. I thought maybe he'd only stay until he was strong enough. But he never left." She stroked the puppy's head, her touch trembling with emotion. "He kept me company. He made the house feel alive again." Her eyes clouded, voice softening. "I didn't think anyone would come if something ever happened to me. But he knew, he understood, and he refused to let me be alone." Henry felt a lump rise in his throat. "He did everything he could, and he made sure you got help." The puppy pressed closer to her as though absorbing every word. Mrs. Foster looked at Henry with quiet sincerity. "Thank you for listening to him. Many wouldn't have." He shook his head. Anyone with a heart would have listened. He wasn't asking. He was begging. Silence settled for a moment, warm and gentle. Then Mrs. Foster took a slow breath. "Henry, I live alone. I've been managing, but this scared me." Her voice wavered. "I don't want him to be alone if something happens. He deserves someone who will love him, like he loves me." The puppy whimpered, sensing the emotion in her tone. Henry leaned forward, eyes softening. "He has you, and as long as I'm around—" He paused, choosing his words with care. "Neither of you will ever be alone again. I'll check on you every day, I promise." Mrs. Foster's eyes glistened with gratitude. The puppy rested its head on her chest, secure, comforted, and trusting that the world had shifted in its favor. And Henry knew that promise had changed all three of their lives forever. Over the next few days, the hospital became a quiet sanctuary of healing. Nurses peeked into Mrs. Foster's room not because they needed to, but because the sight inside warmed their hearts. A fragile elderly woman slowly gaining her strength, and a tiny white puppy who refused to leave her side. He slept curled against her hip, followed her eyes with every tiny movement, and whimpered whenever she drifted too far into sleep. It was loyalty in its purest form, simple, raw, and deeper than words could ever express. Henry visited each day, bringing coffee for the nurses and gentle smiles for Mrs. Foster. The puppy greeted him with excited barks but always returned quickly to her side, as if afraid she might disappear if he looked away too long. Henry felt something grow inside him each time he saw them together. A protective instinct, a sense of responsibility, a realization that he hadn't just stumbled into a rescue. He'd stepped into a bond that would change his life, too. On the 5th day, the doctor entered with good news. "You're healing well," he told Mrs. Foster. "A few more tests, and you'll be able to go home." The puppy barked once, sharp and joyful. Mrs. Foster laughed softly, tears gathering in her eyes. "Home," she murmured. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see it again." Henry offered a warm smile. "You had a very determined guardian." She reached for the puppy, stroking him gently. "I was planning something for him," she said quietly. before the accident. Henry tilted his head, planning, "What?" She smiled down at the puppy, her eyes tender. "To train him as a therapy dog, not officially, just to help people, to be a comfort to someone besides me." Her voice cracked. "He has such a gentle heart." Henry looked at the puppy, at the tiny creature with the courage of something 10 times its size, and felt a lump tighten in his throat. "He saved you," he whispered. "I think he already is one." Mrs. Foster reached for Henry's hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. "Promise me something," she said. "If anything ever happens to me, anything at all, you'll take care of him. He shouldn't go back to being alone in the world." Henry didn't hesitate. "I promise," he said softly. "But you're not going anywhere. Not for a long time." She smiled, and the puppy rested his head on her lap as if agreeing. A week later, Mrs. Foster returned home, with Henry helping her through the doorway. The house felt different now, not shadowed or silent, but filled with life. The puppy raced through the rooms as if celebrating the return of laughter and warmth, and when Mrs. Foster sat in her favorite chair, the puppy curled at her feet with a long, relieved sigh. Henry stood at the doorway, watching them with quiet emotion. In a world that often moved too fast, too cold, too distracted, this tiny puppy had reminded them all of something simple. Love is loudest when spoken without words. Loyalty is strongest when given freely. And heroes come in all sizes, even ones small enough to fit in your arms. Henry smiled softly. "Good boy," he whispered. And the puppy's tail thumped in perfect reply.